I worked in environmental research for 17 years and recently transitioned to government to do work with our water resources team at the Houston-Galveston Area Council. And I work with water monitoring, research, and conservation. So those are kind of my focus areas. I also, in a past life, was a fisheries ecologist, and I have a PhD in marine biology. So all those kind of different things. And so we can talk about things, anything that kind of interests y'all in terms of aquatics. I have focused my presentation really to kind of the special topic this year. And so we'll spend most of our time doing that. But I welcome questions. And if you guys all really are interested in something else, we can talk about that too. So these are the core content areas that are on the Envirothon website. Hopefully you guys have looked at the Texas Envirothon website and explored. There's lots of resources, there's learning objectives, all of that. This is a lot, so we're not going to cover all of this, but all of these are fair game if we want to expand any kind of discussion or conversation. But there's lots of those resources for you. So this is the Earth. It is the blue planet. This is why I think aquatics is the very most important topic that you will cover in Envirothon. So 75% of the Earth's surface is water. Of that, most of it is in the oceans. And then of that, just a very small percentage is surface water. And that's what we would consider water that is available to support life on land, right? We're going to focus mostly on the freshwater section today, mostly on surface waters today. But like I said, we can expand and have discussions about different topics if you guys are interested in that. Hopefully everybody is aware of the water cycle. It's the reason that we can live on Earth. It recycles and distributes water throughout our planet. You know, evaporation, condensation, precipitation, main components, but there's a lot more that goes on than just that. Your students should definitely be very familiar and comfortable with understanding all of the different processes of the water cycle. And just understanding that this is what makes Earth livable. It provides fresh water through evaporation and then precipitation to the rest of the world. Most of the evaporation happens from our oceans. So it leaves that salt behind and then produces essentially fresh water that sustains life. It also regulates climate and weather. I mean, this process makes really solar energy drives that cycle through heat and moisture and water movement. But without this water cycle, we wouldn't have weather and winds and rainfall and those types of things. Transports nutrients. It supports different ecosystems. And it connects all of the Earth's systems. So the biosphere, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the pedosphere, all of those things are connected through that water cycle. A little bit of history on the Clean Waters Act, really like the beginning of the Clean Waters Act in terms of regulation goes all the way back to 1899. So there's the Rivers and Harbors Act and then the Oil Pollution Act, but really the first surface water quality legislation that impacted fresh waters that we have on our continents is the Water Pollution Control Act of 1948. And there was lots of different amendments to this. The major one was 1965. It renamed the act. And this is really the initiation of the development of standards for water quality. So at this level, the water quality is deemed good. And at this level, there is an impairment. It's poor. We need to address it. So who has heard of the Cuyahoga River? Yeah. So the Cuyahoga River is near Cleveland, Ohio. In 1969, it caught on fire. It's not the first time it caught on fire. It actually caught on fire 13 times. And what made this particular fire different was that Times Magazine did a piece on it and covered it. And when they covered it, it really kind of opened the eyes of people throughout the US that there is real water quality issues. They kind of were removed from that if they, didn't live directly next to one of these water bodies. But we can look at some of these pictures. it caught on fire because there was all this petroleum product that was just covering the surface because there was no regulated discharge. Industry was discharging at will, and it resulted in this one very vivid example. And that kind of is what was the catalyst to public demanding action. This is unacceptable. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to make sure this doesn't happen again? So 1 year later, in 1970, responsibility for pollution control in the US was moved from the Department of the Interior to the Environmental Protection Agency, which was created for that purpose. And then the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972, and it essentially established the basic structure that we use today for regulating pollutant discharge into waters. So there's lots of different groups that touch aquatic resources and conservation and management. The EPA really is the federal agency that's tasked with ensuring that we have safe air and safe water. Specifically, the Office of Water is responsible for regulating and then creating guidance from the Clean Water Act. Everything that's underlined is a link. So hopefully you guys can then go and really explore. These are all resources that you can use. First, this EPA Office of Water website. This is a great resource. This is where it has all of your major environmental laws. So you guys can take a kind of closer look at that. And then provides really great information on all these different topics that the EPA Office of Water oversees. The EPA's role is interesting. Most of the requirement for regulation lies with the states, but the EPA has to approve the standards that the states develop and impairments that the states decide on. And so, there's a lot of back and forth and edits and approvals that happen between the state and the EPA. That also means that all different states have different standards. They have different procedures for monitoring and determining if something is impaired. And so it sometimes can make large-scale data analysis and determinations a challenge. We also have NOAA. We always think about NOAA with weather, but they also have the National Marine Fisheries Service underneath them, and they do a lot of coastal work. So things like sea level rise, harmful algal bloom. So they're very involved in those types of aquatic aspects of the coast. USDA, we think of that as agriculture, and they really are focused very much on the agricultural aspects of water quality, water quantity. So for your topic this year, your non-point source pollution, the USDA and the NRCS actually does a lot in that realm. So they're a really good resource as well. And then U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they deal mainly with the biota through the Endangered Species Act. And a lot of times if we have a protected species, that regulation extends to the environment that they live in, the conditions that they need to be able to survive and thrive. So if we're talking about aquatic organisms, they do have their hand in aquatics in that way. Within Texas, we have the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, kind of the EPA of the state, right? And that's where most of the regulation from the Clean Water Act lies within our state. They're the ones that do these integrated reports and send it up to the EPA for approval. They determine standards for our water quality and those types of things. Texas State Soil and Water Conservation Board, that's kind of like our NRCS for the state. They're very ag focused as well, very non-point source focused as well. Let's see, Texas Water Development Board, I think of them more as water quantity. So they're very involved in flooding and freshwater inflow requirements, those types of things, making sure there's enough water to support the ecosystems. General Land Office, they manage all submerged lands of the state of Texas. And so they do a lot of permitting. So if like a new road needs to be constructed, they are the ones that go in and make sure that if there's any habitat that's impacted, it's mitigated for, and they manage that. They also do a lot of disaster recovery work. And then Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, they manage our fish and aquatic resources and our wildlife and the habitats, the environment that they live in. Okay, so focusing on watersheds, we're going to talk a lot about watersheds, and this is kind of where our focus is going to be because I really want to make sure that we cover topics related to non-point source pollution very well. So most water management really is done at the watershed level, and we consider the whole system. So these are some of the terms that your student should know. Looking at this, headwaters are kind of the beginnings of all of our rivers and streams that are flowing into these tributaries and then into the main stem of this watershed. This is the floodplain. So if water overtopped the banks of a incised river, they would go out into the floodplain. And then this all flows down to the mouth of this watershed, which flows into the receiving water body. So these are all terms that are used a lot when we're doing things like total maximum daily loads. If you guys have ever heard of those, determining how much loading of a pollutant a receiving water body can handle, and that helps us set kind of limits and standards for water quality. And then there's these terms ephemeral and perennial. Ephemeral are tributaries that regularly dry up in the summer, typically, and perennial means there's water there all the time. And then we have stream order, trawler stream order. So this is a way for us to kind of measure how complex a watershed is, how large a watershed is. Each water body is given kind of a number. So our headwaters, our initial water bodies, nothing else is flowing into it. Those are ones. As two of the same number come together, that's a 2. And then essentially, if any smaller water bodies are flowing into something, it doesn't change, it doesn't increase the trawler order until 2 of the same size water bodies or larger come together, and then it increases. So you can imagine a watershed with, the main stem having a trawler order of 8. That's a pretty complex watershed. Whereas something like this is actually a pretty simplistic watershed in terms of complexity and probably size. So a watershed body boundary is a delineation that defines the area where if a drop of water fell, it would all go down to one single output, one single discharge point for that area. So there's lots of different ways that watersheds are delineated, but most people use something called these HUC codes. So first, the National Hydrology Data Set, NHD, is all the actual streams, all the lines, and it's mapped. And now they've got a 3D one that's out. It's pretty cool. You can check out their website as well. And then the hydrologic unit code, these HUC, this is the watershed. So this is using topographic data, mapped data, and delineating watersheds based on size. So HUC codes, the smaller the number, the bigger the watershed. So the number of digits in that watershed code. So there's lots of different things that affect watersheds. I think I'd like to just start by checking out this website. This is a really awesome site that you guys can use for like interactive lessons with your students. There's lots that you can do in terms of they can just like explore, they can come up with hypotheses and test them on here. It's a cool website. So it's called Model My Watershed. It's an interactive site. So for our purposes, I'm just going to zoom in to where we are right now. So here is the university that we're at. You can upload spatial files here and delineate a watershed based on, a file that you already have. Or you can use this program to delineate a watershed for you. So this was developed in Delaware, so they've got really fine scale data for that area. But for us here, we're going to use this continental US. And so I can actually go on here and plot a point, and it will delineate the entire catchment, the entire watershed that contributes to that point. So if we want to see when water leaves the campus, what that watershed is like, I'll put a dot right here. And so it's on the fly delineating a watershed based on individual points. So now we can look at the stream network within this watershed. We can do a lot of different things. This will tell us what the total length is of the stream here, what the stream order is, and You can look at land use and land cover. So this is telling me how much developed land versus each of these land cover types are in this watershed. I can actually look at it here as well. Pretty highly developed watershed. We can look at the soil type. So you guys are going to be talking about soils later today, but soil has a lot to do with, let me see. Soil has a lot to do with infiltration of water and then runoff. So in our watershed here, we have a lot of likely what we would call impervious surface. Everybody heard of the term impervious surface? So the more impervious surface, the more quickly the water runs off from a precipitation event, and the more flashy the stream is. So we'll talk about the urban stream syndrome here in a second. But essentially, the soil type, especially if it's non-developed land, the type of soil, so if it's really clay soil, it has really slow infiltration rates, and you would probably have higher runoff. Sandy soils, water's going to infiltrate easier. Native plants, really, in-depth root systems, got a lot more infiltration than mowed lawn. So all of those things are big factors that influence our watershed and how water moves throughout that watershed. So I hope that you guys can play around in this app and use it in your classrooms. There's just endless possibilities of lessons that you guys could put together, real kind of investigative opportunities for your students to kind of develop questions and then look into them and try to come up with solutions or conclusions. So we talked about hydrology, so the stream orders, the actual waterways themselves, land use, land cover, this urban stream syndrome. The more impervious surface you have, it actually changes your hydrograph. So a hydrograph is how we kind of measure the change in a water level in response to a rain event. Over time, so this x-axis is time, and then the discharge or the height of the water is on the y-axis. So in a normal, unurbanized watershed, it rains, as that water infiltrates, some of it runs off. We start to see the river climb, discharge, so the flow increase, and then our water height increase. And then eventually it's going to reach its maximum and then start falling back down as that water makes its way outside of the watershed. In an urbanized stream where we have a lot of impervious surface, the water makes its way to our waterways very quickly. So you typically have a much steeper slope on that hydrograph, and it gets much higher. So less of the water is infiltrating, more of the water is running off. It's running off very quickly, so all at the same time. And so it stacks up on each other, and you get a very high. And this is flooding. This is an urban flooding. So as we channelize all of our waterways, as we pave all of the land, this is what happens in terms of how the water moves throughout the watershed when it rains. There's other terms like lentic and lotic. So lotic is flowing water. Lentic is still water, so lakes versus rivers or streams. Water is a really powerful force, and natural waterways move, they meander. And so it really depends kind of what constrains a waterway. If we think about the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon, that is a very constrained waterway. It is carved through essentially rock. It's not that, it takes a very, very, very long time for that waterway to kind of move. Here in most of Texas, we have large valleys where we have rivers that can move and meander and change within those unconstrained broad valleys. And that's a natural process. So what we've done is we come and we build a bunch of stuff right on the edge of the river because that's, a nice view, or it's where we want to live. But that river's moving and changing constantly. And so what happens is, there's higher velocities on the outside of a turn. And then we have deposition on the inside of a bend in the river. So it's going to continue to gouge out further and further and then deposit sediment on the inside of that turn. And then, so that's where we start getting these really big meanders and rivers. And eventually, water is powerful and it's going to find the path of least resistance. And you're going to have a larger event that's going to cut off that meander and make a straight shot and kind of change the flow of water to short circuit that big meander. And eventually, as sedimentation occurs, that will become something called an oxbow. Yes.
If that's the case, why was the meander ever formed in the first place?
Because as water is flowing down this river, the velocity is going to be highest on the outside. And so it's going to keep digging out and eroding that outside bank. But then velocity is lowest kind of, right here on the inside of this turn. And so when water velocity slows, all of the suspended particles that are in the water have a chance to settle out. And so then that creates sedimentation, and will start building that bank. It is a totally natural process for a river to meander and to keep digging further out and further out until, it reaches kind of an inflection point and there's a large event that's going to cut through that and then disconnect that big meander. Sometimes they stay connected. A lot of times, eventually, it will disconnect, and that creates this oxbow. And oxbows are really important. We're learning more about them now. During flood events where that habitat's reconnected to the river, they've linked that to spawning of gar. It's really an important aspect of their life history. So there's lots of really cool things about oxbows. And then, of course, climate change impacts watersheds. As we consider how we're managing watersheds, we need to really consider potential future scenarios where we have more intense rain events, we have bigger storms, or even droughts, and how that could impact how we're trying to manage our resource and our watershed. So there's lots of really cool interactive maps that you guys can use in your classroom from both FEMA and the Texas Water Development Board. This is a screenshot of that right there. But you can type in an address here. And it will take you to this map. You can hopefully we can see here. So here's our building right here. This is very hard for you guys to see back there, but hopefully you guys will explore this a little bit. There's lots of lesson plans that you guys can create for your students where they're investigating different flood plains, flood hazard areas. If you were going to maybe there's a lot of talk about buyouts. Identify an area that has the highest flood hazard risk that you would want to, investigate for maybe, doing a buyout, trying to help relocate those individuals that are at highest risk to an area outside of a floodplain. Or maybe there's areas that you would identify to restrict new development in because it has a high flood hazard risk. So there's lots of different things that you guys can do in terms of creating activities for your students to really investigate and use this interactive map. Okay, pollution. This year's special topic is non-point source pollution. It begins at home. So we're going to talk a lot about that. There's point source versus non-point source pollution. Everybody familiar with which is which? Point source is really, typically we think of it as permit-based. So people are permitted to discharge from a specific point into the environment a certain amount of pollutant that's acceptable, that's determined to be acceptable. So that can be air pollution, that can be water outputs. Think about a wastewater treatment facility. They've got a specific outfall point where they are releasing their permitted discharge into a waterway.
Does that fall under the Clean Water Act?
Yes.
So they have to clean it to a certain point.
Yes. Well, I mean, it really is regulated by whatever their permit is from the permitting agency of where they're located. So in Texas, that's the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. Yeah. And then non-point sources, these are more diffuse sources. Think of things like stormwater runoff. These are things where we can't necessarily very easily link a pollutant back to its exact point of origin. There's lots of different methods to try to improve non-point source pollution. So we'll talk a lot about that. In Texas, our surface water quality standards establish kind of these explicit goals for the quality of the water in rivers, lakes, streams, bayous, bays, and coastal waters of the state. So the TCEQ develops these standards and the EPA approves them. And then we measure the water that we monitor against those standards to determine if they're meeting those standards or not. If not, that's considered an impairment. And we'll kind of talk about the different levels of impairment. Texas monitors water quality standards for really two purposes: to support public health and enjoyment, and to protect aquatic life. For public health and enjoyment, we use recreational use standards to evaluate that. So that typically uses bacteria as our primary parameter. And we use something called pathogen indicator bacteria. There's a lot of pathogens and bacteria and viruses that could potentially make us sick. And it would be cost prohibitive and time prohibitive to measure them all. And so they have created a correlation between the presence of E. coli in freshwater and enterococci in saltwater, in that when there's high concentrations of those, it increases the likelihood that there will be high concentrations of these other pathogens that could make you sick. For aquatic life use, primarily that's dissolved oxygen. So critters, even that live in the water, need oxygen to breathe and to stay alive. So that's the main way that we measure that. And then there's general use. So we look at nutrients, we look at temperature, also look at pH for general uses. And then there's fish consumption use. So our ability to consume fish and other invertebrates that we catch from the water and make sure that they're safe to eat at all or in certain quantities. So recreational use. I'm going to quickly go through this, but there's a lot of text on this screen, so you guys will have this as a resource. So I'm not going to cover it all. We kind of talked about E. coli and enterococci. There's a certain level at which the probability of someone getting sick if they ingest that water is considered an unacceptable level of risk by the EPA. And so that's how we create our standard for those two, E. coli and enterococci, for our surface waters. So what can we do? Our wastewater treatment facilities, our permitted discharges are highly regulated in what they're allowed to discharge in terms of bacteria. So that's how those point sources are managed. And we can have a whole conversation about that, but we're not going to get into it. We're going to focus on the non-point source. So things that we can do to help reduce bacteria in our waterways. There's a lot of different things. Anybody have any thoughts? Reducing bacteria that makes it into our waterways.
Sewage treatment plants, wetland riparian buffer. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah. So wetlands are nature's sponge. Wetlands are our watershed's kidneys. They help to remove pollutants from waterways through a lot of different processes. So yeah, definitely having tertiary treatment for wastewater go through kind of wetland complexes before it goes into our waterways is a great way to do that. Also, just even things like bioswales and rain gardens and things like that will trap and remove bacteria before that water makes it into our waterways. So who has a dog? Okay. Do we pick up our dog poop? So you think, you kind of think like there's 1 million dogs in the Houston area. And you're like, some of those dogs are pretty little, I mean, how much could it really, like, I don't live really close to the creek, what could it really do? I've got numbers here. I don't want to lie to you. So if there's 1 million dogs, that's over 315 tons of dog poop a day, just in this greater Houston watershed. So that's 52 dump trucks of just straight poop a day. If it rains and that washes into the storm drains, which then wash into our waterways, you don't even have to live close to the creek for that poop to make it into the creek. So in a lot of our really urban watersheds, we actually think that pet waste is a sizable, measurable contributor to bacteria in our waterways. So that is something that we can all do by picking up dog poop. Also, there is reporting hotlines. There are complaint hotlines. If you see something, say something. There are ways for us to, if we, have a concern about something, to report it so that it can be addressed. Maybe you would be surprised. I don't know. We do something called targeted bacteria monitoring, where we find through our regular monitoring of water bodies what areas have the highest bacteria. And some of these water bodies have very high bacteria levels. They're highly impaired and they consistently have high bacteria levels. That tells us that there's probably something that's not working properly. So we go and investigate that. And what we do is our team walks in the water body, the entire length of the water body from the bottom to the top. And we do this during dry weather conditions. So it hasn't rained in 3 days. So anything that's flowing is not from rain. It's not runoff stormwater. And then we sample directly from those pipes. And what we'll find sometimes is raw sewage that's flowing into our waterways. And there could be a conveyance line underground that is broken, disconnected, and is now flowing into our stormwater conveyance system. Sometimes people have illicit pipes. I've found pipes coming directly from somebody's house where they, for whatever reason, aren't plugged in to sanitary sewer lines, and they are no longer using on-site sewage facility, maybe like their septic tank that they had before, and they now have a straight pipe that's going out into the waterway. So we do those investigations a lot and find those types of things.
What's the penalties for those? Are there penalties?
Yeah, it really depends. Unfortunately, a lot of times in terms of personal homeowners that have like illicit connections, illicit pipes, they probably don't have the resources to correct that. So it's kind of tricky, penalizing somebody that didn't have the resources to begin with. So what we try to do is we do on-site sewage facility homeowner assistance programs. So low-income people can fill out an application, and then we will pay for and coordinate on-site sewage facility repair replacement program. So there's lots of those. And I think I have a link in here that HGAC's homeowner wastewater assistance program. There's programs like it throughout the state to help people that otherwise are unable to maintain their systems. Lots of different things that we can do. Livestock often can have direct access to waterways. Their fecal matter also can carry parasites and bacteria and pathogens and viruses that could hurt us. And so there's lots of different things. Wildlife, we can't really do much about the wildlife, but feral hogs are of a particular concern, and that's an invasive species. And so there are programs out there.
Are there regulations for like those feedlots, those pigs?
So yeah, Texas State Soil Water Conservation Board does a lot of work with the ag community to try to educate them about and to provide assistance for them to have other water options for their livestock and to stop direct access with livestock to waterways. There's like hoof rot. There's lots of other kind of negative things that can happen to livestock that are in waterways. And so they kind of try to use those and provide resources and assistance to landowners to create, maybe a well that is providing fresh water for their livestock so they don't have to access the river. A lot of times you don't even have to fence livestock from getting to a river, if they've got a consistent and clean water source, they would prefer to not go down to the river. So you don't even have to do fencing. You just have to provide them with a consistent, clean drinking source, and they themselves will choose not to go down and muck around in the mud in the river. Okay, let's move on. We can come back and talk about that more later. So for dissolved oxygen, for aquatic life use, we look at dissolved oxygen. When there's low dissolved oxygen, some fish are more tolerant, some are more intolerant. Same thing with macroinvertebrates. So we can actually tell a lot about a water body just based on what critters are living in it. But if we have periods of low dissolved oxygen, fish can become very stressed. Obviously, that reduces their fitness. So they might have lower reproduction rates. They might have a lower, health metrics. And then eventually, of course, they could die. So if you guys have ever witnessed a fish kill in a waterway, it's pretty gross. Texas Parks and Wildlife and the Texas General Land Office both have kills and spills teams that respond to those. And that's another whole interesting, management discussion topic that we could have. But both the Texas General Land Office and Texas Parks and Wildlife Department have kills and spills biologists. I would really recommend that you find who your local kills and spills biologist is. And that's a really cool guest lecture to have in your class. They've got some crazy stories. They can show some really cool pictures. And it really makes you think and consider what does happen? Because that's all of our resource. And so when we have a fish kill and the result is a large number of fish that die, if they can identify the source of that kill, they can assign penalties, to the cause of that. And it can add up pretty quick, especially, commercially, recreationally important fishes have a really high value. So it's really cool to hear them talk about what their process is, how they do an investigation, how do they quantify everything that's dead, and how do they assign value to that, and then assess those penalties.
Can fish kills happen just from the Texas heat? Sometimes we have really prolonged days over 100 or whatever. Can that cause a fish kill?
Yes. And temperature itself can, but also the higher the temperature, the less dissolved oxygen the water can hold. So they are related to one another. So one of the best ways that we can help improve aquatic life use is always making sure that there's a riparian zone along our waterways so that there's shading, so that those temperature fluctuations aren't as large, and it's just more consistent. So we're going to move on. You guys can read through this. Nutrients are really important. Everybody's heard of eutrophication. So that's an important kind of term and concept for your students to know. Water temperature, primarily as it impacts dissolved oxygen, but also as climate changes, as temperature increases, especially on the edges of species ranges, that can really impact what critters are present. Also, a lot of our invasive species tend to be warm weather species. And so as our minimum temperatures continue to increase, we'll probably have less chances of die-offs of those invasive species, and they'll become more prevalent. PCBs and dioxins are the two pollutants that are monitored by the Department of State Health Services. And so the website's there. I also would recommend that y'all take a close look at that website. Most of those impairments are in coastal water bodies, but I think a lot of people aren't really aware of the consumption advisories that exist in terms of no consumption. So that means that no level of eating this species from this water body is safe, to limited consumption. And those limited consumptions are usually focused very much on women of childbearing age and children, because these are pollutants that you never get rid of them. They accumulate in your body throughout your entire life. And women, the only time we can get rid of them is we pass them on to our offspring. And that's primarily done through breastfeeding. 80% of your pollutant load can go to your kiddo. So that's why they have limited consumption for women of childbearing age so that we're not starting off those kiddos at a higher level. There's a lot of other water quality parameters that we measure. And so it would be really good to understand kind of each of these, what the source is of these, and what impacts they have on aquatic systems. And I mentioned, what critters are present in a water body can tell us actually a lot about the health of that water body. So typically that's done through something called the Index of Biotic Integrity, an IBI. And so we know that some species are very tolerant. We know some species are very intolerant. So if we collected all the species that are present in a water body, and there's a really high percentage of them that are tolerant species, and we don't have very many intolerant species, that probably tells us that the health of that water body is poor, and vice versa. Here's a bunch of different water quality data resources. Again, great for interactive assignments for your students to really get them like critical thinking exercises, understanding and considering using real data, interactive real data. So this How's My Waterway tool on the EPA, it's cool. You can type in your address. It will take you to your area. It will show you all the waterways in your area. It'll tell you if they're impaired, what they're impaired by, give you tips for, how can you help? What can you do? In the Houston region, we have something called the Water Resources Information Map, the RIM. This is a resource that I manage and develop. And same kind of thing, we can interact with this dashboard. We can choose a watershed. It will tell us these are all the active monitoring sites that we have, that we're going out and regularly visiting the site and collecting data. We can click on one of them. It'll tell us about it. And then we can go to a station page that is going to show you kind of real-time data and if something is impaired or not. So this is kind of a cool resource. There's a lot of, opportunity for investigating the data, trying to decide, well, why would this site maybe be impaired, but this one's not? You can then maybe use the Model My Watershed tool, look at what the land use land cover is, how developed it is, and start thinking about really what a watershed manager thinks about on a day-to-day basis to try to evaluate and maintain water quality. Rowena, did you print out those case studies? Oh, right here. These, I think I would expect that this type of thought process would be very beneficial for your students looking at preparing for Envirothon. And it's just, these are good resources kind of for you guys to do some more critical thinking with your students.
So the red bar, does that indicate there's a problem in that set?
Yeah, you can't see here. Yeah, but we've got a little key down here.
Oh,
So
okay.
red is non-supporting, it's fully supporting or no concern. And I can click on this and it'll tell me what each of those levels mean. Mm-hmm. Yep. And I also included my email address at the beginning of the presentation. So feel free to reach out to me. This is what I do every day, all day. So I'm happy to talk about it.
It's just about the dog poop. Do you see? Do you see more E. coli like in the waterways after a big rainstorm in like Houston? Because all the dog poop.
So there is something called microbial source tracking, where we can see where the E. coli that we're measuring came from, like what species it came from. I'm using some genetic techniques.
Oh, wow.
And so primarily we're focused on knowing if it's human or not. But there have been studies that kind of say this proportion of the bacteria in the waterway is human. Like just think of a pie chart. This is, probably pets. This is livestock. This is wildlife, those types of things. And that, varies.
Human would be from like flesh and fluid.
Yeah, so if there was an issue with a water treatment facility where they had an overflow or something like that, or a failing on-site sewage, so a failing septic system, or we kind of talked about there could be just direct pipe situations. So yeah, we, really wastewater treatment facilities function very, very well. And overflows typically are tied to like a big rain event, a flood, an overwhelming of the system. But under normal circumstances, their outfalls are meeting their permit standards. Primarily, it's on-site sewage facilities, so areas that aren't plugged into sanitary sewer, where we tend to see the most impairment from that.
So, in areas where there is a lot of danger of flooding when, say, hurricanes come through. So, like, I know an area that was hit by Hurricane Harvey, and when that happened, there were houses that got 6 feet of water that had never gotten water before, but it was in a flood-prone area, but people hadn't realized. They're like creeks that far away, we're good. How do you suggest helping educate people in that area, or helping educate our students to understand how flood-prone an area is and where flooding could occur?
Yeah, so I provided you 2 links, one for the Texas Water Development Board, one for FEMA. And they have interactive maps. You can type in your address, or if you're looking to buy a new house, you can type in your address, and you can see if you're in a floodplain. You can see how close you are to the nearest floodplain or what flood zone you're in. And so, yeah, just knowledge about that. So I flooded in Hurricane Harvey. My house had never flooded before. It was an old, an older house. It was built in the 60s. I had flood insurance because even though I wasn't in a flood zone, it wasn't required. And like less than 20% of people in my area had flood insurance that flooded. So yeah, I mean, I think we just need to make sure that people understand that these resources do exist. They're out there. And since Harvey, flood maps have been redrawn. There's also a future scenario option on the FEMA flood map. So you can click on that and see where they expect flood zones to be in the future. And so, yeah, that would be my recommendation, just to empower people. And I think that, real estate agents need to be a part of that solution as well.
And floodplain.
And developers need to stop developing in floodplains.
Would they change in future floodplains? Would that be because we're building and having more impervious surfaces? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So in certain areas like Harris County, if you build, you're required to mitigate that runoff. Yeah, that change. So it's no net change is the rule. That's the term. No net change in flow.
Is there a problem with like aquifer pollution?
Absolutely. Yeah, we didn't even get into that, but groundwater is another whole thing. Yeah.
Where I'm from, we had a problem with karst region where you flush went straight into the water table.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they're very strict water quality standards in those areas because that's a lot of times your drinking water. Yeah. Thank y'all.